Back in April, I covered the GODOX VL series of lights and suggested that they were finally a viable alternative, fixing many of the issues I had with their previous SL lineup. Well, since then, GODOX has brought two more models into the mix, the UL150 and the SL150 Mark II, and today we're going to see which of the three is the best choice for the money. Oh, and I'm trying my best to call them GODOX now, even though the company's name was, and literally translated to GODOX, because GODOX is what they prefer to be called. Let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and sometimes I care too much. So the main way that GODOX seems to be separating themselves from Aperture and other competition in these recent lights is noise. What I liked most about the VL150 is how much quieter it was than the SL series, and how the fan curve was relaxed to the point that I could run the light at up to 50% without the fan ever turning on. In fact, that's what I'm doing right now. That light behind me has been the VL150 since April, and the fan never turns on when I'm recording, and it's set to 45% power, which seems to be the output to silent sweet spot on that light. Well, now this new UL150 is completely silent all the way up to 100% power, because it doesn't have a fan. It's passively cooled, which explains why it's so big. It's not particularly heavy, it's just really large to accommodate the giant heatsink that's in there. If you remember from the previous video, the VL150 is considerably smaller, even though the output of the two lights is pretty much the same. At 1 meter with no modifiers, the VL150 measures 6350 lux, and the UL150 measured 6480 lux. And if you put on the included reflectors, which are also identical, it jumps to 65,800 lux and 67,700 lux respectively. So very similar, but the UL150 seems to be about 2 to 3% brighter at full power. But if you normalize for noise, that's where the UL150 really shines. When both lights are set to their maximum output while remaining silent, the VL150 only hits 2900 lux, where the UL150 maintains its 6480 because, again, no fan, so you can run it at 100% power with no noise. So there you go. For $40 more, you can get a light that is much bigger but is silent all the way up to 100% power, which also beats the output of the VL150 by 2% at its 100% power. End of story. Well, no, because then GODOX introduced the SL150 Mark II, which also seems to prioritize silence by adding a dedicated fan off button, which removes any guesswork from finding the ideal power setting on the VL150. On this light, you basically just get two operating modes. Both range from 1% to 100%, but one range is brighter than the other because it has the fan running. The 100% output with the fan on the SL150 Mark II is 6440 lux, so again, very similar to the other two lights, and with the fan off, it's 2350 lux, which is a bit lower than my sweet spot for the VL150, but again, removing any of the guesswork, and it's guaranteed to stay off for potentially longer than the VL would, maybe if the environment was warmer. The SL150 Mark II also comes with the same reflector and sees the same bump up to about 60,000 something lux range when on. I also tested the CRI and TLCI of these lights, and they're all very similar in the 96 to 97 range, but I'll show you some actual color chart and skin renditions a bit later since they're more useful than synthetic scores in my opinion. Now, the SL150 is $60 cheaper than the VL150 and $100 cheaper than the UL150, but it does have some limitations. First of all, it's much heavier because the power supply is built into the light head, which means two things. One, the power cord is shorter, because it just uses a single C13 cable, and two, it's not set up for battery operation. So this is more of a studio light, but it does have a couple of strobe effects built in, but they aren't too exciting. It also doesn't come with a carrying case, just this flimsy cardboard box. But it does have the other accessories like a remote control and the reflector that I mentioned earlier. Surprisingly, the UL150 doesn't come with a carrying case either, despite being the most expensive light. Only the VL150 seems to come with the case, which looks like this. It's a pretty decent padded case, similar to the ones you'd get from Aperture. The build quality of all three of these lights is great, and it's a big step up from GODOX lights of the past. You'll remember how impressed I was with the VL150 build. Well, the same is true for the UL and SL Mark IIs. They're using the much better brake design with the locking yoke with the double gasket rosettes, so they're not going to slip even with heavy modifiers. Solid metal construction, secure Bowens mounts with excellent release levers, and there's thoughtful features like umbrella holders and two-way spigot receptacles on all three lights. You really can't go wrong with any of the three in those regards. The major difference is the V-mount battery capability, which only the VL and the UL lights have, and they both do it identically with your typical three-piece power configuration. You've got a long cord that goes from the outlet to the power brick, then an XLR that goes from the power brick to the control box, and then the control box has another XLR cable that goes into the light. The power ratings and design of these elements is identical on the VL150 and the UL150, but if you own both lights, don't mix them up because the VL150 control box will not work on the UL150 even though it looks the same. I tested that to find out. Nothing bad happened. The light just wouldn't turn on. They are labeled right here on the front of the controller, but just be careful not to bring the wrong one on a shoot. You can interchange the reflectors though, as they're seemingly identical and they give the same output regardless of the light they're placed on. These three lights give a very similar spread and beam angle as well. The SL150 Mark II doesn't have a control box, but it's built into the back of the light. But all three of these lights can be controlled down to 1% in 1% increments from 100%. Now, even though the silent operation does seem to be the focus, I also tested the sound level of the lights with the fans on. The VL150 came in between 39 and 40 dBA at 100% power, which is just a touch louder than the Aperture 120D, which measured between 38 and 39 dBA. The SL150 Mark II was a bit louder though at 40 to 41 dBA, and I didn't measure the UL150 because again, it doesn't have a fan. Alright, now let's take a look at the color reproduction. One thing you likely noticed when I compared the VL150 to the Aperture 120D Mark II in my previous video was how different the white balance seemed between the two lights. Usually when I compare lights, I like to set a neutral white balance and then see how the lights differ from each other. Obviously, you should white balance for the light you're using, but I think this test is useful because it gives you a good idea of what lights might play well together and conversely, which lights might give you mixed lighting problems. For these shots, I put the Light Dome Mini 2 on with the grid and placed it just under a meter or around 2.5 feet away. The white balances coming out of these lights were 5400 Kelvin for the VL150, 5500 Kelvin for the UL150, and 5320 for the SL150 Mark II. So I set my camera's white balance to 5400 Kelvin with zero tint correction, and I put all the lights at 100% power. Each light was giving around 2500 lux through the Light Dome Mini 2, which meant I could stop down to f11 at ISO 800 using S-Log2. If you wanted to expose two stops over for S-Log2, I found f5.6 worked well for that in this configuration. So plenty of output for a close key light on any of these lights. Turning off the fan on the SL150 Mark II did significantly underexpose the image though. Now there's a noticeable difference in the tint of my skin as we changed lights. The aperture leaned more on the warm and green side, where the SL150 Mark II was much cooler and more magenta. So I probably wouldn't mix these two lights together unless you had a creative purpose in mind. The VL150 and UL150 were much closer and can probably be used interchangeably, but I was particularly impressed with the UL150 here. I found there was virtually no color cast in my neutrals on the color checker, and my skin fell perfectly on the skin tone line on the vector scope. I also felt it produced a very pleasing contrast. When focusing on just the color checker, the UL150 also produced the best color accuracy on the vector scope. They're all producing pretty great results here, but the UL150 is slightly better. Now if we white balance all the shots to each light and try to even out the exposures, most of the differences subside and really each light becomes very usable. The only noticeable difference was that the Aperture 120D Mark II was a little less powerful and I had to open up the aperture a touch, which does affect the way my skin looks a little, but that should be perceived as more of a con than a pro, even if it does look a touch more pleasing, because you can always reduce the power on the other lights to do the same thing. I did find the SL150 Mark II to look a bit more drab comparatively once the magenta was white balanced away, but again, pretty marginal. Alright, so to conclude, another excellent batch of lights from GODOX. It's difficult to pick a clear winner because they're all within $100 of each other and offer very similar benefits. If money is super tight and you don't need battery power, the SL150 Mark II is a fine choice. I do prefer the design of the VL150. The light quality is slightly better, it's smaller, lighter, can be battery operated, and comes with a carrying case, all for only $60 more. I'd say it's worth that $60, and I would still recommend it. You get similar functionality to the fan off setting on the SL150 Mark II by just setting the VL150 to 45% or lower. And those power settings are easy to figure out on all three of these GODOX lights because their response is completely linear. 100% is twice as bright as 50%, and so on, which is something I prefer on these GODOX lights over the 120D Mark II, which instead uses a curve to ramp up the brightness. This curve is configurable on the Aperture 300D Mark II, but not the 120. The Aperture still has the better power system design and a cleaner build overall, but these GODOX lights have closed the gap enough to make them viable alternatives with only minimal compromises in ergonomics, and they even pick up some wins in that category with the umbrella holders and those better spigot mounts. So for me, it comes down to the VL150 versus the UL150. Now the UL150 is the better light when it comes to color accuracy and output. The differences are small, but it's consistently a few percent better across the board. And it's completely silent all the way up to 100%, so noise normalized output but stomps all over the COB competition. But it costs $40 more, doesn't have a carrying case, which really does annoy me, and is nearly more than twice the size. But I do like that it can still be battery powered. So the VL150 is probably still the most versatile package, but if you're looking for the best light quality you can get in a COB at the lowest noise level possible, the UL150 is a fantastic option for that purpose and a useful addition to the GODOX lineup. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video entertaining, or at least helpful, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, try setting the playback speed to 75%. Alright, I'm done.